When Shock walked into a struggling elementary school disguised as an ordinary substitute teacher, nobody knew the man standing in worn-out clothes was one of the most famous athletes in the world. He came looking for answers about how people treat those who seem powerless, but he never expected to find a 10-year-old boy named Ethan Carter carrying a pain far too heavy for a child. While the world saw Shaq as a giant, Ethan was a child who felt invisible, a boy who saved half of his sandwich for his sick mother, hid his deepest feelings inside a black notebook, and quietly wondered if there was anywhere he truly belonged. But as Shaq uncovered the stories of the forgotten people inside that school, he discovered that the smallest acts of kindness could open the biggest doors, and one child's hidden drawings would remind him that sometimes the person who needs to be seen the most is the one everyone else has already walked past. Shaq sat in the back of a quiet van, staring at the old pair of glasses in his hands. He had agreed to this social experiment without telling many people, just a small crew with hidden cameras. The idea was simple but powerful. Spend a week as an ordinary substitute teacher in a struggling elementary school and see how people treated someone they thought had no power at all. No fame, no money, no spotlight, just Mr. Turner, a tall guy in worn-out clothes trying to help kids. Shaq adjusted his faded jacket, slouched his shoulders a little, and practiced speaking softer. He wanted to blend in, to really feel what it was like for someone who walked through those doors every day without anyone noticing. As he stepped into the school that first morning, the smell of old floors and cafeteria food hit him right away. Kids rushed past, teachers called out names, and everything felt busy but tired. Principal Margaret Collins met him in her office, barely looking up from her papers. She was a sharp woman with tight lips and eyes that seemed to size people up in seconds. She did not smile or shake his hand warmly. Instead, she glanced at his clothes and said, "I need someone who can control a classroom, not someone looking for attention. We've had enough flakes come through here." Her voice was flat, like she had already decided he was not worth much. Shaq kept his face calm. He looked her in the eye and answered quietly, "I'm not here to prove who I am. I'm here to understand what these children need." He meant every word. Inside, he felt a small twist in his chest because he knew how quick people could judge a man based on nothing but how he looked that day. Margaret just nodded like she had heard it all before and pointed him toward the fourth-grade classroom. No welcome, no questions about his experience, nothing. She had no idea the quiet substitute standing in front of her was one of the biggest names in basketball history. Walking down the hallway, Shaq took in the colorful posters on the walls. One big sign caught his eye right away, painted in bright letters by the students. "Everyone belongs here." The words looked cheerful, full of hope. But then he noticed a young boy sitting alone on a bench near the lockers. The kid had no lunch bag, no friends laughing around him, and nobody stopped to ask if he was okay. He just stared at the floor. Small shoulders hunched like the weight of the whole day was already too heavy. Shaq slowed his steps. That sign and this moment did not match at all. It was the first clear sign that the words on the wall and the real life inside this school were two very different things. His heart felt heavier as he kept walking, wondering how many other kids felt invisible every single day. The bell rang, and Shaq found his way to Laura Bennett's classroom. The kids looked up when he walked in, but it was not the usual wide-eyed stare he got from fans. These children watched him with careful eyes, like they were waiting to see if he would disappear too. He set his old backpack down and tried to smile gently, hoping to show them he was really there. Something about the quiet way they studied him told Shaq this was going to be more than just a week of teaching. These kids had stories, real struggles, and he was about to step into the middle of them without anyone knowing his real name. For the rest of that first morning, Shaq moved slowly through the simple lessons, listening more than talking. He noticed how some kids perked up when he asked real questions, while others stayed folded into themselves. The boy from the hallway, Ethan, sat near the back, drawing quietly in a black notebook. Shaq did not push, but he made a mental note to keep an eye on him. By the time lunch came, that lonely image from the hallway kept replaying in his mind. He had come here to learn about how people treat the powerless, but already he was seeing something deeper, how a whole school could say the right words while some kids still felt completely alone. Shaq leaned against the wall for a moment between classes, thinking about his own childhood and the doors that had opened for him because someone cared enough to look twice. Now he was Mr. Turner, and he wondered how many doors stayed closed for these children every day. The experiment had just started, but he already felt the pull of real stories waiting to be heard. He took a deep breath and headed back inside, ready to listen. Shaq stepped into Laura Bennett's fourth-grade classroom right after the bell, carrying nothing but a simple notebook and that old backpack. The kids all turned their heads at once, watching him the way people watch a stranger who might not stick around. It was not his height that made them stare. They had seen plenty of tall substitutes come through before. No, it was the quiet caution in their eyes, the kind that comes from watching too many adults promise to stay and then vanish when things got tough. The room felt heavy with that unspoken doubt, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what this new Mr. Turner would do. Laura Bennett gave him a tired but kind smile from her desk before stepping out for a quick meeting. Shaq stood in front of the class, trying to look as ordinary and steady as possible. He could feel their careful gazes following his every move. These were good kids, he could tell, but trust had been chipped away one broken promise at a time. He started to say something simple about having a good day together when a girl in the front row slowly raised her hand. Her name was Emily, and her voice came out small but clear. "How long are you staying?" The whole room went completely silent. No one shuffled papers or whispered. They all waited, eyes fixed on him. Emily did not stop there. She looked down for a second, then added, "The last substitute promised he would come back. We never saw him again." Her words hung in the air like something everyone had been thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. A few kids nodded slightly, and one boy near the window looked away quickly, like the memory still hurt. Shaq felt a sharp tug in his chest. These children were only 9 or 10 years old, but they had already learned that grown-ups could disappear when you needed them most. He stood there for a moment, letting their silence settle over him, understanding that this was not just about math or reading today. It was about showing up in a place where showing up mattered more than anything. Shaq looked at each of them, his eyes soft and honest. He spoke in a low, steady voice so they could all hear. "I can't promise every day will be easy, but I can promise this. I won't disappear when things get difficult." The words came from a deep place inside him, from his own memories of people who had stayed when life got hard. He meant it with everything he had, even if they only knew him as Mr. Turner right now. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, at the back of the room, something shifted. Ethan Carter, the quiet boy with the black notebook, slowly lifted his head. His eyes met Shaq's for the first time, really looked at him. Like maybe, just maybe, this time someone might keep their word. The rest of the morning moved gently after that. Shaq kept things simple, asking the kids about their favorite parts of the day so far and listening like their answers truly mattered. Emily sat a little straighter. A couple of other children started raising their hands more freely, but it was Ethan's small glance that stayed with Shaq the most. That boy had not said a word, yet in that one look, Shaq saw a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. The promise was out there now, and Shaq knew he would have to earn it every single day. As the clock ticked toward lunch, he felt the weight of what he had stepped into. This classroom had stopped trusting adults a long time ago, but maybe, just maybe, one tall substitute in old clothes could start changing that. Shaq glanced back once more before the kids lined up for recess. Ethan was still watching him quietly from his desk. There was something fragile and hopeful in the boy's eyes that made Shaq even more determined to stay true to his word. This was only day one, but already the real story of this school was unfolding, one careful moment at a time. Shaq stood at the front of the classroom the next morning with a quiet kind of energy that felt different from the usual routine. He was not there to just hand out worksheets or read from a book like the substitutes before him. Instead, he turned math into something real, problems about splitting groceries when money is tight or figuring out how much time a single parent needs to get everyone to school on time. For science, he pulled out simple supplies they already had in the room and let the kids mix things together to watch colors change and bubbles rise, their faces lighting up with real curiosity for the first time in days. The classroom started to feel warmer, more alive, like the kids were finally allowed to be kids again. He could see small smiles breaking through and shoulders relaxing just a little. Then Shaq asked them a question that stopped everything. He looked around the room and said softly, "What is something adults have never asked you?" The kids went quiet at first, thinking hard. One by one, hands went up, and the answers they gave hit him like a punch to the heart. A girl near the window whispered, "Why does my mom cry when she thinks I'm asleep?" Another boy said, "If you don't have a home, what address do you write on the paper?" And then a small voice from the middle of the room added, "Are poor kids allowed to have big dreams?" Shaq felt his throat tighten as he listened. These were not silly kid questions. They were heavy truths that no child should have to carry alone. He nodded slowly, letting them know he heard every word, his eyes stinging, because each answer showed just how much these little ones were hurting inside while trying to act normal every day. The room stayed hushed after that, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with relief that someone had finally asked. Shaq moved between the desks, offering gentle words and listening without rushing anyone. That was when he noticed Ethan again. The boy had not written anything down. Instead, he was drawing carefully in his black notebook. Shaq walked over quietly and knelt beside his desk so he would not tower over him. On the page was a simple but powerful drawing of a house with 26 windows. Every window glowed with warm yellow light, like families were safe inside, except for one dark window that stood out cold and empty. Shaq studied the picture for a long moment, his chest aching with the weight of it. He asked gently, "Who lives in the dark window?" Ethan kept his eyes on the paper for a second, then said in the softest voice, "Someone who hasn't found the way home yet." The words were so quiet, but they landed heavy between them. Shaq felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He placed a big hand lightly on the edge of the desk and told Ethan, "That's a really strong drawing. It shows how much you notice." In that moment, the connection felt real, like a small bridge had formed between a giant man pretending to be ordinary and a boy who carried too much silence. Ethan gave the tiniest nod, something close to trust flickering across his face. Right then, the classroom door opened sharply. Principal Margaret Collins walked in, her eyes scanning the lively scene with clear disapproval. The kids had been laughing softly during the science experiment, voices buzzing with excitement as they shared ideas. She crossed her arms and said loudly, "Fun doesn't improve test scores. This is not what we do here." Her tone cut through the warmth like cold water. Shaq stood up slowly, keeping his voice calm but firm. He looked at her and replied, "Scores show what children know. They don't show what children had to survive before they walked into this classroom." The words came straight from the stories he had just heard, full of the pain and hope those kids had shared. Margaret's face tightened. She did not argue back in front of the class, but the look she gave him said everything. From that moment, she saw Mr. Turner as a problem, someone who was stirring things up instead of keeping everything quiet and controlled. She turned and left without another word, but the tension stayed in the air. Shaq turned back to the kids, who were watching him closely now. He gave them a small, reassuring smile. "We're going to keep learning in ways that matter," he said. Inside, he knew this was only the beginning of the pushback, but seeing the classroom come alive again, especially that spark in Ethan's eyes, made every bit of it worth it. These kids deserved more than just getting by. They deserved to be truly seen. Later that afternoon, as the kids headed out for recess, Shaq stepped into the hallway and noticed a man working quietly near the lockers. His name was George Miller, the school maintenance worker who had been there for nearly 20 years. George moved steadily, fixing a loose door handle without anyone stopping to say hello. Shaq watched him for a moment and realized something that sat heavy in his gut. Principal Margaret never called him by his name. She just pointed and said things like, "Get the maintenance guy," whenever something needed fixing. It was as if 20 years of hard work had made George almost invisible, just another tool in the building instead of a person who showed up every day no matter what. Shaq felt a familiar ache because he had seen that kind of quiet disrespect before, and it never got easier to watch. Shaq walked over during a quiet moment and introduced himself as Mr. Turner. George looked surprised at first, then gave a tired but genuine smile and wiped his hands on his work pants. They talked for a few minutes about small things, like how the old heating system kept breaking down and how the kids sometimes left messes that made the days longer. George did not complain. He just kept working, sharing little stories about certain kids he had watched grow up over the years. There was a kindness in his voice that made Shaq want to know more. In a school full of busy adults rushing from one crisis to the next, George felt like one of the few steady hands holding things together in the background. The next day, Shaq stumbled onto something that really hit him hard. He was helping move some supplies after class when he saw George in the storage room, carefully working on a broken wheelchair that belonged to a little girl in the 2nd grade. The parts were new, and George was paying for them out of his own pocket, quietly tightening screws so the chair would roll smoothly again. No one had asked him to do it. He was not getting any extra money or thanks for it. Shaq stood there watching for a second, his chest tightening with respect and sadness all at once. When George noticed him, he just shrugged like it was no big deal and said, "A child should never feel like they are a burden just because they need help." His voice was low and matter-of-fact, but the words carried the weight of someone who had seen too many kids struggle without anyone noticing. Shaq knelt down to help him finish the last adjustments, and in that small, shared moment, he understood something important. The people who got ignored the most in this school were often the ones quietly holding everything together. George had been there for 20 years, fixing what was broken, watching over the kids in his own way, and asking for nothing in return. Meanwhile, Margaret barely acknowledged him. It made Shaq think about his own life, how easy it was for the world to celebrate the big names while missing the steady hearts doing the real work every single day. He promised himself right then that he would not let George stay invisible, not while he was around as Mr. Turner. As they finished up and wheeled the chair back to its spot, George gave a small nod of thanks. Shaq felt more determined than ever to pay attention to the people without names in these hallways. The experiment was showing him layers he had not expected, stories of quiet strength that deserved to be seen. George went back to his tools, and Shaq headed toward the classroom, carrying that lesson with him. In a place that said, "Everyone belongs here," some of the most important hearts were still waiting to be truly recognized. The next morning started with a small bright spot in the school hallway. Martha Wilson, one of the older lunch ladies, came in carrying a worn tin box like she did every week. Inside were homemade cookies made from her late husband's family recipe, soft and warm with that special touch only someone who really cares can give. Martha brought them because she remembered what real hunger felt like from her own hard days long ago. She liked seeing the kids' eyes light up when she passed them out quietly during lunch, slipping an extra one to anyone who looked like they needed it most. It was her way of saying the world did not have to be so cold. Shaq noticed her gentle smile as she set the box on the counter, and for a moment the whole place felt a little warmer because of her quiet kindness. But that warmth did not last. Principal Margaret Collins walked by the staff area later that morning, saw the cookies, and without saying much, picked up the whole box and dropped it straight into the trash. Not just the cookies. The handwritten recipe card tucked carefully inside got ruined too, stained and torn among the garbage. Martha froze for a second, then rushed over and knelt down right there on the dirty floor, digging through the trash with shaking hands to try and save that piece of paper. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "That paper was the last thing my husband ever wrote for me." The pain in her voice was raw and quiet, the kind that comes from losing one more precious thing from someone you loved and still miss every single day. She kept searching through the mess, her fingers getting dirty, while a few staff members looked away like they did not know what to do. Shaq had been walking back from the classroom when he saw it all happen. His heart dropped hard. He did not hesitate. He walked straight over, lowered his big frame down onto the floor beside Martha, and started helping her pick up the damaged pieces. He moved gently, handing her the bits of the recipe card one by one, his own chest tight with anger and sadness. "I've got you," he said softly, staying right there with her while she tried to smooth out the wet, torn paper. In that moment, kneeling together on the cold floor, Shaq felt the weight of how small acts of cruelty could break someone's spirit. Martha had only wanted to share a little love from her hardest memories, and now even that was taken away so carelessly. Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and gave Shaq a small, grateful nod. "He used to bake these with me on Sundays," she said in a shaky voice. "Now it feels like I'm losing him all over again." Shaq stayed beside her until she had gathered what she could, listening as she shared just a few more quiet memories. He helped her stand back up and made sure she had a moment to catch her breath. The whole thing left a heavy feeling in the air, but it also showed Shaq even more clearly how much this school needed real care, not just rules. People like Martha were the heart of the place, bringing warmth where it was missing, and watching her hurt like that made him more determined to stand up for the ones who usually got overlooked. As the day went on, Shaq kept thinking about that scene on the floor. It was not just about cookies, it was about respect, about remembering people's pain, and about how one person in power could crush the good things others tried to build. He glanced toward the lunchroom later and saw Martha trying to smile again for the kids, and it stirred something deep inside him. This experiment was opening his eyes wider every single day, showing the quiet battles happening in the shadows of these hallways. And he knew he could not just watch anymore. By the middle of the week, Shaq had started noticing Jessica Reed, the young teaching assistant who moved through the classroom like someone carrying 1,000 quiet hopes. Jessica was always the first one there in the morning, and usually the last to leave at night. She spent her own money on extra pencils, crayons, and little notebooks for kids who could not afford them, never making a big deal about it. After the final bell, she stayed late grading papers or setting up activities for the next day, her eyes tired but determined. Her big dream was simple but powerful. She wanted to become a certified teacher, to have her own classroom and make a real difference for kids who needed it most. Shaq saw the way she lit up when a student finally understood something new, and it reminded him how much heart some people poured into this work even when no one seemed to notice. One afternoon, while helping clean up after an activity, Shaq found a stack of papers that had fallen behind a filing cabinet. He picked them up and realized they were evaluation reports. Most of them were about Jessica, and they were full of small, cutting comments that painted her as unreliable and not ready for more responsibility. Shaq's stomach turned when he saw Margaret's signature at the bottom of each one. These negative reports had been sent quietly to the district office, not because Jessica was doing a bad job, but because Margaret wanted to keep her working cheaply as an assistant instead of letting her move up. It was a hidden betrayal that explained why Jessica kept getting passed over, even though she gave everything she had. Shaq felt a slow burn of anger rise up inside him as he put the papers back, realizing how much this one decision was holding a good person back. Later that day, when the kids were gone and the room was quiet, Shaq found Jessica sitting at her desk, staring at a certification application she had started filling out months ago. She looked worn out, the kind of tired that comes from fighting the same battle every single day. He sat down nearby and gently told her what he had found. Jessica listened without interrupting, then let out a shaky breath. "I'm not afraid to start over," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "I'm hurt because I thought I was finally moving forward." Tears welled up in her eyes as she talked about all the late nights, the supplies she bought with her grocery money, and how close she had felt to reaching her dream. Shaq listened, his heart aching for her, because he could see how much she truly cared about these kids and how hard she had worked to get here. The two of them sat there for a while as Jessica shared more about the little things that kept her going, like the thank you notes from students or the way a struggling reader finally smiled when she stayed after school to help. But underneath it all was the pain of being held back on purpose by someone who was supposed to support her. Shaq nodded slowly, feeling the weight of it. This was not just about one rude principal anymore. It was a bigger problem, a system that let good people get stuck while kids missed out on the teachers who actually fought for them. He told Jessica she was already making a difference and that her heart was exactly what these students needed. She gave him a small, grateful smile through her tears, but Shaq could tell the wound ran deep. As he left the school that evening, Shaq thought about everything he had seen so far. George working without thanks, Martha's kindness thrown away, and now Jessica's dream being quietly crushed. The more he looked, the clearer it became that the real struggles in this building went far beyond test scores and classroom rules. People with good hearts were being worn down every day, and the kids were the ones who felt it most. Shaq walked a little slower, his promise from the first day feeling heavier, but even more important. He was not going to let these stories stay hidden. Not anymore. A few days into the week, Shaq started paying closer attention to Ethan during lunch. The boy never finished his sandwich. Every single time, he carefully wrapped up half of it in a napkin and tucked it into his backpack like it was something precious. At first, Shaq thought maybe Ethan just was not very hungry, but the pattern kept repeating. One quiet afternoon when the other kids were outside, Shaq sat down near him at the lunch table and asked gently, "Why do you always save half?" Ethan looked down at the table for a long moment, then said in a small voice, "My mom doesn't like hospital food." Shaq froze right there, the simple words hitting him harder than he expected. He could see the worry in Ethan's eyes, and in that instant, everything felt heavier. Shaq did not push right away, but later that day after school, he found a quiet corner and sat with Ethan so the boy could talk if he wanted to. Slowly, the truth came out in pieces. Ethan's mom, Rachel, was seriously ill and had been in and out of the hospital for months. They had lost their apartment because the medical bills kept piling up higher than they could ever pay. Now they moved between temporary places, sometimes staying with friends, sometimes in shelters, and Ethan slept wherever they could find a safe spot for the night. He was only 10 years old, but he was already trying to take care of his mom by saving that half sandwich for her, hoping it would taste better than whatever they gave her at the hospital. Shaq listened with a lump in his throat, his big hands resting quietly on his knees. The thought of this little boy carrying so much worry every day broke something inside him. Ethan was not just quiet. He was surviving in ways no child should ever have to. The next morning, Shaq watched Ethan even more carefully. The boy tried hard to stay awake during lessons, but halfway through the day, his head started to drop onto his desk. Exhaustion had finally caught up with him after another rough night. He fell asleep right there in class, small shoulders rising and falling with tired breaths. Before Shaq could do anything, Principal Margaret walked in, saw Ethan sleeping, and shook her head with clear annoyance. She pulled out her notepad and wrote quickly, labeling him lazy, unmotivated. She did not ask why. She did not check if he was okay or what was happening at home. She just made the note and moved on like that was all there was to know about the boy. Nobody questioned it. The label stuck there on paper, cold and unfair, while Ethan kept carrying burdens that would crush most grown-ups. Shaq felt anger and sadness twist together in his chest as he covered Ethan lightly with a jacket so the boy could rest a little longer. He thought about that half sandwich, the dark window in the drawing, and all the quiet pain Ethan hid behind his notebook. This was not laziness. This was a child who was bone-tired from loving his mom through the hardest thing in their lives. Shaq stayed close, making sure no one else bothered him, and promised himself again that he would not let Ethan feel invisible. The other kids glanced over with worried eyes, like they understood more than the adults sometimes did. By the time Ethan woke up, blinking slowly and looking embarrassed, Shaq gave him a small, kind smile and said it was okay. The boy nodded, but the weight in his eyes stayed. Shaq realized this school was full of stories like Ethan's, hidden struggles that got covered up with easy labels instead of real help. His promise from the first day felt more real than ever. He was not going to disappear when things got difficult, especially not for this boy who was already being so strong. The classroom felt quieter after that, but Shaq's heart was louder, beating with the need to do something that actually mattered. Toward the end of the day, the classroom emptied out faster than usual, kids rushing to buses or waiting parents. Ethan had been one of the first to leave, but as Shaq straightened up the desks, he spotted the black notebook left behind on the boy's chair. He picked it up carefully, meaning to set it aside for tomorrow, but it slipped open in his hands. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Page after page was filled with drawings so full of feeling that they seemed to come from someplace deep and private. These were not ordinary kid sketches. They were raw windows into a world most adults never bothered to look at. Shaq sat down slowly at Ethan's desk, turning the pages one by one, his breath catching as the pictures pulled him in. The drawings told stories without any words. One showed a whole city with wings, like it could lift off and fly away from all its troubles. Another had a mother lying sick in bed, her arms wrapped protectively around her son, even while she looked weak and tired. There was a simple dinner table with 2 chairs, but only one person sitting there, the empty seat saying everything about loneliness. Then came page after page of endless doors, stretching down a long dark hallway. Some cracked open just a little, others shut tight. Each one felt heavy with the same quiet hope and fear that Ethan carried every day. Shaq's fingers trembled a little as he kept going, realizing how much this boy saw and felt, but never said out loud. The final drawing hit the hardest. It was a glowing door at the end of that hallway, soft light spilling out like a promise. Underneath it, in careful young handwriting, Ethan had written, "Maybe somewhere there is a place where nobody has to apologize for needing help." Shaq stared at those words for a long time, the simple sentence cutting straight through him. He could picture Ethan drawing this late at night in whatever temporary place he and his mom were staying, hoping for a world that did not make him feel like a burden. The beauty and the pain mixed together on the page in a way that was impossible to turn away from. For the first time since this whole experiment began, Shaq felt tears well up and spill over. He sat there alone in the empty classroom, big shoulders shaking quietly as he cried. It was not just because the drawings were beautiful, it was because he understood them. Every single line. He had been a child once too, searching for his own door, wondering if anyone would ever see him when life got hard and lonely. Those old feelings came rushing back, mixing with the fresh hurt of knowing Ethan was living through it right now. Shaq wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming for a little while longer. This notebook was not just art. It was Ethan's heart laid out on paper, asking for the one thing every kid deserved, a safe place and someone who stayed. Shaq closed the notebook gently and held it for a moment, making a silent promise to the empty room. He would protect this boy's world as best he could. Tomorrow he would return it without embarrassing Ethan, but he would never forget what he had seen. In that quiet classroom, with the late afternoon light coming through the windows, Shaq felt more connected to these kids than ever. The black notebook had opened something in him too, reminding him why showing up really mattered, Ethan's drawings were a cry for help wrapped in hope, and Shaq was determined not to let that cry go unanswered. After the final bell the next day, Shaq waited until most of the kids had gone home before he approached Ethan. The boy was packing his bag slowly, like he was in no hurry to leave for whatever temporary place waited for him tonight. Shaq sat down in a small chair nearby, so he would not seem so tall, and said gently, "I found your notebook yesterday. You left it on your desk." Ethan's eyes widened with sudden fear. He froze, clutching the strap of his backpack, and asked in a shaky voice, "Are you going to show everyone?" The worry in that question broke Shaq's heart all over again. This boy had poured his deepest feelings onto those pages, and now he was scared the whole world would see them. Shaq shook his head right away and looked Ethan straight in the eyes. "No one gets to enter your world without your permission," he said softly. "That notebook is yours. Those drawings are yours. I only looked because I care about what's going on with you. But I won't tell anyone else unless you want me to." The words seemed to ease some of the panic in Ethan's face. He sat back down slowly, still holding his bag tight, but the tight line of his shoulders relaxed just a little. Shaq stayed quiet for a moment, giving the boy space, then told him how much the drawings had touched him. He spoke honestly about seeing the love for his mom in every line, and how brave it was to create something so real. Ethan looked down at his hands for a long time before the words started coming out. His voice was small and full of hurt. "If everyone says I'm a problem, maybe they're right." The sentence landed heavy between them, like he had been carrying that fear for months. Shaq felt his chest tighten. He leaned forward a bit and answered firmly but kindly, "A lie, repeated many times, is still a lie." Then he added, "You are not lazy. You are carrying things no child should have to carry." Ethan's eyes filled with tears as Shaq kept talking, naming the hard truths without making them sound too big or scary. He told Ethan it was okay to be tired, that saving half a sandwich for his mom and worrying about hospital rooms and moving around all the time was a lot for anyone, especially a 10-year-old. They sat together in the quiet classroom as the light outside started to fade. Shaq shared just enough of his own childhood memories to let Ethan know he was not alone in feeling unseen. "I know what it's like to wonder if anyone really sees you," he said gently. Ethan listened, wiping his eyes every now and then, and for the first time he started opening up a little more about the nights his mom felt really sick and how he tried to be strong for her. The conversation was not loud or dramatic. It was simple and honest, the kind of talk that builds a bridge between two hearts. Shaq made sure Ethan knew he believed in him, not just as a student, but as a good kid who was doing his best in a tough situation. By the time they finished talking, Ethan looked a little lighter, like some of the heavy weight had been shared. He even gave a tiny nod when Shaq promised to keep checking in on him. As the boy headed out to meet his mom, Shaq stayed behind for a minute, thinking about how many children walked around with the same invisible pain. This one conversation would not fix everything, but it was a start. Ethan needed to hear that he was not the problem. The real problem was a world that sometimes forgot to ask why a child was tired. Shaq felt more sure than ever that staying and listening was the most important thing he could do right now. That afternoon, a big storm rolled into the city without much warning. Dark clouds gathered fast, rain started pouring down in heavy sheets, and thunder rumbled so loud it shook the windows. Teachers hurried the kids out as parents rushed in with umbrellas and coats. The hallways cleared quickly, filled with the sound of goodbyes and splashing footsteps. But when the last bus pulled away, Ethan was still standing by the front doors, small backpack on his shoulders, staring out at the rain. Nobody came for him. He waited quietly, getting smaller with every passing minute while the storm kept getting worse. Shaq noticed right away and felt his stomach drop. He stayed close, making sure the boy was not alone in all that noise and darkness. Principal Margaret Collins came down the hall with her keys, ready to lock up for the night. She saw Ethan and frowned, checking her watch like this was just another inconvenience. "The school cannot become responsible for every family problem," she said sharply, already turning away. Shaq stepped forward, his voice low but strong. "To you, he is a problem. To him, this is his whole life." The words came out firm, carrying all the frustration he had been holding in. Margaret looked at him coldly, but Shaq did not back down. He was not about to let Ethan stand there in the storm like he did not matter. The rain kept hammering against the roof as the two adults stood there, the tension thick between them. Just then, a call came through to the office from the hospital. Rachel had collapsed at work earlier that day. She was stable for now, but still unconscious, and the doctors needed someone to know. The news hit the room like another bolt of thunder. Ethan stood there listening, his face pale and his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. After a long silence, he looked up with eyes that suddenly looked much older than 10 and asked in the smallest voice, "If my mom doesn't wake up, who signs my school papers?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Everyone in the room broke a little inside. Teachers who had been rushing to leave stopped cold. Shaq felt tears sting his eyes again. That was not a question any 10-year-old should ever have to ask. It cut deep, showing just how alone and scared Ethan really felt in that moment. Shaq knelt down right there in the hallway and put a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy leaned into him just a little, the storm outside matching the one happening in his heart. Margaret stood quiet for once, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. No one knew exactly what to say, but the truth was clear. This was bigger than school rules or closing time. A child was facing the scariest night of his life, and all the systems that were supposed to help had left him waiting in the rain. Shaq stayed right beside Ethan, talking to him softly about how they would figure it out together, making sure he knew he was not facing this alone. The storm kept raging outside, but inside that school, the real weight settled heavy on everyone who heard that question. Shaq's promise from day one felt more important than ever. He was not going anywhere, not when a boy needed someone to stay through the hardest night. The crew filming quietly from the background captured it all. But for Shaq, this had stopped being an experiment a long time ago. It was real life, and right now, Ethan's life needed protecting more than anything. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the production team started texting Shaq, urging him to wrap up and leave for the night. They reminded him this was just an experiment and that he had already gathered plenty of footage. But Shaq shook his head at his phone and refused. He was not going anywhere. Ethan needed someone to stay, and all the cameras and schedules in the world did not matter more than that. He told the crew quietly but firmly that Mr. Turner was staying right here tonight. Deep down, this had become much more than a social experiment for him. It was about keeping a promise to a boy who had already been let down too many times. The team eventually backed off, and Shaq turned his focus back to the quiet waiting room near the front office where Ethan sat watching the rain. Not long after, the school doors opened again despite the pouring rain. George Miller walked in first, shaking water off his jacket and carrying a thick, clean blanket he had grabbed from home. He did not say much, just handed it to Ethan with a gentle nod and sat down nearby like it was the most natural thing in the world. A few minutes later, Martha Wilson came through the door with a warm container of soup she had heated up quickly at home. She had remembered how much Ethan liked the simple chicken noodles she sometimes served at lunch. She sat beside the boy and encouraged him to eat a little, her voice soft and full of that same caring heart that made her bring cookies every week. Then Jessica Reed arrived, her hair still damp from the storm. She had brought some homework and books, thinking she could keep Ethan's mind busy, but when she saw how tired and worried he looked, she quietly put them away. Instead, she just sat with the group, offering small smiles and gentle words. Nobody had asked any of them to come back. They simply showed up one by one because they cared. In that moment, the school felt less like a building and more like a shelter for a boy who needed it most. Shaq watched them all with a full heart, seeing the same people who usually went unnoticed now stepping up without hesitation. They stayed together through the long hours of the storm. George told a couple of quiet stories from his 20 years at the school to help pass the time. Martha made sure Ethan stayed warm and had something in his stomach. Jessica checked in softly, reminding him he was not alone. Shaq stayed right in the middle of it, his big presence steady and calm, making sure Ethan felt safe. The rain kept falling outside, but inside there was a warmth that had been missing from these hallways for a long time. These were the people who stayed, the ones who saw a child in need and chose to show up even when it was not their job or their responsibility. As the night stretched on, Ethan leaned against Shaq's side a little, the blanket wrapped tight around him. The simple acts of kindness from George, Martha, and Jessica seemed to wrap around the boy just as much as that blanket did. Shaq felt proud of them and hopeful in a way he had not expected when this week started. This was what real community looked like, not fancy words on a poster, but people coming back in the storm because they refused to leave a child behind. The night nobody came for Ethan turned into the night when several somebodies chose to stay. The morning after the storm, the classroom felt different, heavier with everything that had happened the night before. Ethan sat at his desk looking exhausted, but a little less alone after the long hours with the adults who stayed. He tried to stay awake, but his head dipped again during the quiet reading time. That was when Principal Margaret Collins walked into the room without warning. She spotted Ethan right away and stopped in front of the class, her voice sharp and loud. She started scolding him in front of everyone, saying he needed to try harder and stop using excuses. The words were meant to embarrass him, to make an example out of the boy who kept falling asleep. Ethan shrank down in his seat, cheeks burning red while some kids looked away uncomfortably. Shaq felt his blood run hot, but before he could step in, something else happened. Emily raised her hand slowly from the front row. Margaret barely noticed at first, still going on about responsibility and focus. Then Emily stood up, her small voice clear and steady even though her hands were shaking. "You keep asking why he doesn't try harder," she said, looking straight at the principal. "Did you ever ask where he slept last night?" The room went completely silent. No one moved. No one whispered. The words hung there, brave and honest, cutting through all the pretending that everything was fine. Margaret looked stunned, her mouth opening but no sound coming out right away. Emily did not stop. She spoke about seeing Ethan wait in the rain and how tired he always seemed, her voice growing stronger with every word. One by one, the other children started standing up beside Ethan, first a couple in the back, then more across the middle, until almost the whole class was on their feet. They stood quietly but firmly, a small wall of support around their friend. It was not loud or angry, it was powerful in its stillness, a group of kids who had finally found their voices for someone who needed it. Shaq watched with pride and emotion swelling in his chest. These children had seen the truth all along, and now they were showing the adults what real care looked like. Ethan lifted his head slowly, tears in his eyes as he looked at his classmates standing there for him. Margaret stood frozen, her face flushed. The silence in the room felt louder than any shouting could have been. She muttered something about talking later and left quickly, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The kids stayed standing for a moment longer, then slowly sat back down, some of them reaching over to pat Ethan's shoulder or give him small smiles. Emily sat too, but she looked different now, like she had discovered something strong inside herself. Shaq gave her a proud nod from the front of the room, his heart full. This was the moment the classroom had been building toward, kids protecting one of their own when the grown-ups had failed. The rest of the morning carried a new kind of energy. The students were more united, checking on Ethan and each other in small ways. Shaq felt a quiet hope growing stronger. One brave girl's words had changed the air in the room, showing that even the youngest voices could push back against unfairness. Ethan was not alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The people who stayed, both the adults from the night before and the kids today, were starting to shift something important in this school. It was just the beginning, but it felt like real change was finally in the air. Later that same day, while the kids were at recess, Shaq stayed behind to help Laura Bennett organize some papers in the classroom. As they worked, a folder slipped from a high shelf and scattered across the floor. Shaq bent down to pick everything up and froze when he saw what was inside. They were reports written by Laura over the past several months. She had carefully documented hungry students coming to school without breakfast, teachers burning out from too much work and not enough support, and unfair decisions that hurt the most vulnerable kids. Page after page showed the same problems Shaq had been seeing all week. But none of those reports had ever made it past Margaret's office. They were all tucked away here, hidden and ignored, like the problems themselves did not exist if no one higher up had to read them. Laura looked tired as she watched him sort through the pages. She had tried so many times, she said quietly, but nothing ever changed. Shaq felt a deep frustration building inside him. All this time, the struggles of Ethan, George, Martha, Jessica, and so many others had been written down and then buried. The system that was supposed to protect these kids had instead protected the principal's image. Laura sat down heavily at her desk, admitting how worn out she felt from fighting these battles alone. Shaq listened, nodding slowly as the weight of everything settled over both of them. It was not just one or two mistakes. It was a pattern of silence that let good people and good kids keep struggling in the dark. After school, when things had quieted down again, Shaq stood in the empty hallway, thinking about what he had found. The production team was around, waiting to see what he would do with this new information. Some people might have wanted to use it for a big dramatic takedown, but that was not what Shaq had in mind. He looked at the hidden reports one more time and said firmly, "I don't want revenge. I want the truth to become impossible to ignore." His voice was calm, but full of quiet strength. He knew exposing the files the right way could finally bring real help instead of just headlines. The goal was not to destroy someone. It was to make sure these kids and the people who truly cared about them finally got heard. Shaq spent some time talking with Laura about the next steps, making sure she knew her efforts had not been wasted. The discovery of those files added another layer to everything he had witnessed during the week. It showed how deep the problems went and how much courage it took for people like Laura to keep speaking up even when no one listened. As the sun started to set outside, Shaq felt more determined than ever. This was not about one principle anymore. It was about fixing what had been broken for too long. He held onto those reports carefully, knowing they carried the voices of everyone who had been trying to make things better all along. The truth was coming, and he would make sure it could not be hidden again. The next morning, Ethan came to school a little early, still carrying the weight of worry about his mom. He trusted Shaq enough now to pull out his black notebook and open it carefully. "There's something else in here," he said softly. Tucked behind the very last page was a folded letter, the paper worn from being read many times. It was from his mother, Rachel, written before one of her riskiest medical procedures. Ethan handed it to Shaq with shaky fingers, wanting him to read it too. Shaq took the letter gently, his heart already bracing for whatever words were inside. The handwriting was neat but tired, like Rachel had poured every bit of love she had left into those lines. Shaq read the words slowly, feeling them sink deep. Rachel had written, "If one day I cannot stand beside you, remember this: never make yourself smaller just because someone else cannot see your worth." The sentence hit Shaq hard, full of a mother's fierce hope for her son, even when she was fighting for her own life. Then came the next part that brought tears to both their eyes. She told him, "You don't need someone else to give you a door. You can draw your own." Ethan sat quietly beside Shaq as the letter was read out loud in a gentle voice. Those words were her way of giving him strength for the days when she might not be there to hold his hand. It was the kind of love that reached past fear and hospital rooms, straight into the heart of a boy who needed to know he was enough. Ethan wiped his eyes and whispered that his mom had read it to him before the procedure, making him promise to keep it close. The letter had become his secret armor, something he looked at on the hardest nights when they moved from place to place. Shaq felt overwhelmed by the quiet power of a mother's words. Even while lying in a hospital bed, Rachel was still fighting for her son's future, teaching him to believe in himself when the world tried to make him feel small. The glowing door in Ethan's drawing suddenly made perfect sense. His mom had been helping him draw it all along. They sat together for a while, the notebook open between them like a bridge of courage. Shaq told Ethan how proud his mother would be of the strong, kind boy he was becoming. The letter was not just ink on paper. It was a lifeline, a reminder that love could survive even the scariest storms. Ethan nodded slowly, a small spark of hope returning to his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he looked like he truly believed he could draw his own door someday. Shaq carefully folded the letter back into its place and handed the notebook to Ethan. This hidden message changed how he saw the whole week. Behind every quiet moment and every tired glance from the boy was a mother's powerful love pushing him forward. It made the work they were all doing feel even more important. The classroom slowly filled with other kids, but that private moment between Shaq, Ethan, and Rachel's words stayed warm in Shaq's heart. Some doors were drawn with pencils, but the best ones were built with love like this. The final day of the week brought everything to a head. Principal Margaret Collins called an all-school meeting in the gymnasium, standing at the front with a stern face. She wanted to make an example out of Mr. Turner. She accused him loudly of ignoring school rules, disrupting routines, and getting too involved in things that were not his business. Her voice echoed through the room as she listed every little thing she had held against him from the very first day. Teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kids sat wide-eyed, some of them glancing toward Shaq with worry. Ethan gripped his notebook tight, and Emily sat up straight like she was ready to speak again if needed. The air felt thick with tension, like everyone knew this moment had been coming. Margaret was trying to shut down the changes that had started happening, but Shaq stood tall and calm in the middle of it all. When she finished, Shaq stepped forward slowly. He reached up, took off the fake glasses, and straightened his posture. The whole room went dead quiet. "My name is Shaq," he said simply. For a second, no one moved. Teachers' mouths dropped open. Kids gasped and stared. Margaret froze completely, her face turning pale as the realization hit her. The giant substitute teacher who had quietly turned the classroom around was actually Shaquille O'Neal. Whispers spread fast through the gym, turning into shocked murmurs. Shaq looked around at all the faces and added in a steady, heartfelt voice, "The saddest thing is that you only started listening after you knew my name." Those words landed heavy, cutting through the surprise and touching something deep in everyone who heard them. The truth of it stung, because it was so real. All week, Mr. Turner had been ignored or pushed aside, but now the same ideas suddenly mattered because of who was saying them. The room erupted into applause and cheers from the kids and staff. People stood up, clapping hard for the man who had shown them what real care looked like. But Shaq raised his hands and stopped them gently. "Don't applaud me," he said, his voice warm but serious. "George has been here 20 years. How many people ever thanked him?" The clapping faded as every head in the room turned toward George Miller, standing near the back. The maintenance worker looked stunned, his eyes filling with tears as the attention suddenly landed on him. Years of quiet, unseen work were finally being recognized in front of everyone. George wiped his eyes, overcome with emotion, while the kids started cheering for him too. Martha and Jessica stood nearby, smiling through their own tears as the moment sank in. Shaq kept talking, shining the light on the real heroes of the school. He spoke about Martha's kindness, Jessica's dedication, Laura's hidden reports, and all the small acts that held the place together. The gym filled with a different kind of energy now, one of gratitude and reflection instead of shock. Ethan looked up at Shaq with pure admiration, and Emily clapped the loudest for George. In that moment, the whole school felt seen in a way it never had before. Margaret stood off to the side, silent, the weight of everything finally showing on her face. Shaq stepped back after that, letting the attention stay where it belonged. The reveal was not about him. It was about making sure the people who had been invisible for so long finally got their moment. Tears, hugs, and quiet conversations spread through the crowd as the meeting ended. Shaq felt a deep sense of peace mixed with hope. Mr. Turner had disappeared, but the changes he helped start were just beginning to take root. The kids surrounded George and the others, showing their thanks in the purest way. It was a powerful ending to the week, one that would stay with everyone long after the cameras stopped rolling. The day after the big reveal, the classroom felt calmer, but still full of everything that had happened. Ethan sat with Shaq during a quiet moment and opened his notebook again. This time, he pointed to the letter from his mom and said softly that Shaq could read part of it out loud if he wanted. Shaq took the paper carefully, his voice warm and respectful, as he read the lines about never making yourself smaller and drawing your own door. The words filled the small space between them with love and strength. Ethan listened with shining eyes, nodding along like the message was helping him stand a little taller. Sharing it felt like one more step in trusting that he did not have to carry everything alone anymore. Shaq handed the letter back gently, telling Ethan how special it was that his mom had given him those words to hold on to. The boy smiled a real smile for the first time in days. Right then, the classroom door opened slowly. Everyone turned to look. Rachel stood there, still weak from the hospital, but alive and on her feet. She held onto the doorframe for support, her face tired but full of determination to get to her son. The whole room went quiet with happy surprise. Ethan looked up and froze for a second, like he could not believe what he was seeing. Then he whispered in the smallest, most hopeful voice, "Mom, are you really here?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she answered softly, "I'm late, but I came back." Those simple words broke open the dam. Ethan dropped his notebook and ran straight into her arms, burying his face in her shoulder as she held him tight. The hug was everything, full of all the fear and love they had carried through the hardest weeks. Shaq stood back with a lump in his throat, watching the mother and son hold each other like they would never let go. Tears slipped down a few faces around the room. Emily wiped her eyes and smiled big. George and Martha, who had come by to check on things, stood in the doorway with happy, relieved looks. Jessica clapped a hand over her mouth, overcome with joy. Rachel kissed the top of Ethan's head and whispered how proud she was of him for being so strong. The moment felt like the answer to every prayer and every quiet worry the boy had carried. After everything, his mom had come back through that door, just like he had drawn in his notebook. They stayed like that for a long time, the class giving them space, but clearly sharing in the happiness. Shaq felt his own eyes sting as he thought about the letter and the glowing door. This was the door they had both been hoping for. Rachel looked over Ethan's shoulder and gave Shaq a grateful nod, knowing from the quick words they exchanged that this kind substitute had been there for her son when she could not. The reunion healed something deep in the room, reminding everyone that love and second chances could still win even after the darkest nights. The rest of the afternoon passed in a warm glow. Ethan stayed close to his mom, and the other kids gathered around to welcome her with drawings and small stories. It was not a perfect ending yet, but it was a powerful one. A mother had come back, and a boy who had saved half his sandwich finally got to share a full meal with her. Shaq watched it all with a full heart, knowing this was the kind of moment that made every hard day worth it. The mother at the door had brought hope back with her, and the whole classroom felt brighter because of it. In the weeks after Shaq's time at the school, real change finally started to take root. The investigation into how the school had been run uncovered years of ignored reports and unfair decisions. Margaret lost her position. The news spread quickly through the community, and while some people felt a sense of justice, Shaq refused to celebrate anyone's downfall. When a local reporter asked him for a comment, he stood quietly for a moment before saying, "Removing one person does not heal everyone they hurt. The real work starts after tomorrow." His words carried a deep truth. Taking her out of the role was only the first small step. The real healing would come from the way the teachers, staff, and families came together to do better for the kids. Shaq wanted the focus to stay on building something stronger instead of pointing fingers, and that choice earned him even more respect from the people who had watched everything unfold. From that point on, new beginnings began to bloom all around the school and the neighborhood. George Miller received the public recognition he had quietly deserved for 20 long years. During a special assembly filled with students and staff, the kids gave him standing applause and handmade thank you cards. He was promoted to a role where he could help plan better facilities and support programs. His steady presence finally valued the way it should have been all along. Tears rolled down George's face as he looked out at the smiling children who now called him by name. Martha Wilson took her love for baking and opened a small community bakery just a few blocks from the school. It quickly became a warm gathering spot where families could find affordable meals, fresh cookies, and someone who remembered what hunger felt like. She hired a few parents from the school and made sure extra portions always went to kids who needed them. Jessica Reed completed her certification and stepped proudly into her own full-time classroom. The extra supplies she had once bought with her own money were now supported by the school, and she brought a bright, caring energy that helped every student feel seen. Laura Bennett returned to teaching with renewed hope, knowing her careful reports had finally made a difference. Most importantly, a new support fund was created for struggling families in the community. It helped cover medical bills, emergency housing, food assistance, and after-school programs so that no child would have to save half a sandwich for a parent in the hospital or worry about where they would sleep at night. The fund carried Ethan's story in its heart, and donations poured in from people who had been moved by everything that had happened. One bright afternoon, a few weeks later, Shaq met Ethan outside the school for a special goodbye. He handed the boy a beautiful set of professional art supplies, high-quality pencils, sketchbooks, markers, and everything an artist could dream of. Tucked inside was a handwritten note that read, "I'm not buying your future. I'm giving you more colors to create it yourself." Ethan's face lit up with pure joy as he opened the box, running his fingers over the new tools that would help him draw even bigger dreams. Then, without saying anything at first, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his old, worn-down pencil, the very one he had used for every drawing in his black notebook through all the hard nights and lonely days. He held it out to Shaq and said softly, "Keep this. It helped me survive." Shaq took the pencil with both hands like it was made of gold. He slipped it carefully into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, and pulled Ethan into a big, warm hug. In that moment, the giant man and the young boy stood as equals, connected by everything they had shared. The simple gift exchange carried more emotion than either of them could put into words. It was a quiet promise between them, that the hard days had shaped them but would not define their futures. Ethan had his mom back, a stable place to live, and now the tools to keep creating his own doors. Shaq carried away a small pencil that reminded him why showing up and staying mattered more than any fame or spotlight. As they said goodbye, Ethan looked up with shining eyes and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Turner." Shaq smiled through the tears he tried to hold back and replied, "Thank you for teaching me how strong a door you can draw." The chapter of Mr. Turner had closed, but the new stories were just beginning. Stories of healed hearts, recognized heroes, and brighter futures for every child who walked through those school doors. It was a different kind of ending, one built on real hope, quiet courage, and the power of people who choose to stay. Shaq left the school that day, knowing the best parts of this experience would live on long after the cameras were gone. 6 months later, Shaq walked into a small but lively art exhibition at the community center. The room was filled with families, teachers, and kids admiring the colorful pieces on the walls. He had come especially to see Ethan's work. In his mind, he expected to see something like the old glowing door from the Black Notebook, maybe a new version with brighter colors. But when he reached Ethan's section, he stopped in his tracks. The painting in front of him was something entirely new, bigger, and full of life. Ethan stood nearby, looking proud but a little nervous as he waited for Shaq's reaction. The months had been good to the boy. He seemed taller, more confident, and his eyes carried a quiet strength that had not been there before. The painting showed a long school hallway lined with 26 open doors. Bright light spilled out from every single one, inviting anyone to step through. Behind the doors were beautiful scenes of possibility, a room full of science experiments with bubbling beakers and smiling kids, another with music where children played instruments and sang, a medical lab where doctors in training cared for patients with kindness, an art studio bursting with color, and spaces filled with all kinds of dreams taking shape. At the very end of the hallway stood a tall figure, strong and steady, holding one final door open with a gentle hand. The title of the painting, written neatly at the bottom, was simply "The Person Who Stayed." Shaq felt his chest tighten as he took it all in. It was more than just art. It was Ethan's whole heart on canvas, showing the world he had imagined and the person who had helped him believe it was possible. Shaq stood there for a long time, studying every detail. The open doors represented every opportunity the kids at the school now had, because people had chosen to listen and help. The tall figure at the end felt deeply personal, and Shaq's eyes grew misty. When he finally turned to Ethan, he asked softly, "Why didn't you draw the person's face?" Ethan smiled, that same quiet, knowing smile from the old days. "Because people would think this painting is about someone famous," he said. Then he looked straight at Shaq with warm eyes and added, "It's about a teacher." The words landed gently but powerfully. Shaq felt a wave of emotion wash over him, the kind that comes when someone sees the best part of you. Shaq swallowed hard and asked, "You know I wasn't really Mr. Turner, right?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Everyone knows Shaq," he replied, "but Mr. Turner was the person who sat beside me when nobody was watching." Those simple words said everything. They captured the heart of the whole experience. Not the fame, not the size, not the spotlight, but the quiet moments of showing up and truly seeing a child who felt invisible. Shaq pulled Ethan into a tight hug, the kind that lasted long enough for both of them to feel the full circle of their journey. Tears slipped down Shaq's face, and he did not try to hide them. This boy had come so far, from saving half a sandwich to painting entire worlds of possibility. They stood together in front of the painting as families came by to admire it and congratulate Ethan. The support fund had helped his mom get stronger, the new programs at school were making a difference, and Ethan was thriving with his art and his friends. The tall figure in the painting was not about celebrity, it was about the teacher who stayed, the one who kept his promise on the very first day. As they walked out of the exhibition side by side, Shaq kept one hand on Ethan's shoulder, carrying that old pencil in his pocket like a treasured keepsake. This was the true ending. Not dramatic or perfect, but full of real hope, healed hearts, and open doors. A boy had learned he could draw his own future, and a giant had learned again what it meant to simply stay. The painting with 26 doors would hang in the school hallway soon, reminding every child who walked by that someone was always there, holding the door open. And that was more than enough.